Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Raptors Roundtable. Now, if you're here for episode 4, I'd like to think that you know everybody that's here. But in case you don't, I'm JJ Buckets, and you're obviously on the Ward Reports channel, so you know who he is. And then if you know the two of us, you probably know who Clutch Takes is. But nonetheless, what's up, everybody? We are back, and we have a few new topics today to discuss. For Raptors stuff, we came across this interesting idea of, after seeing the Pacers talk about how they are open to like really reshaping the roster and like seeing a lot of names go, a name that I think everybody likes here kind of popped into our heads immediately. And we are exploring the idea of the Raptors potentially making a move for Myles Turner. Other than that, we want to talk about Damian Lillard and his situation in Portland and whether or not the time is now for him to get out, whether or not they should retool around him. And if the time for him is to get out, we're going to talk about where we'd like to see him go. Past that, with the playoffs continuing, we are going to talk about who the biggest threat is to the Brooklyn Nets at this point. Obviously, I think it's very safe to say the Nets are the title favorites as we currently stand, but that doesn't mean they're locked for the championship by any means. I think there's a few good teams out there that could knock them off, and I think each of us have maybe a slightly different team in mind for that, so it's going to be really interesting. But we're going to kick things off with obviously Myles Turner and the Toronto Raptors. This is a name that I have personally had in the back of my head for the Raptors for a really long time because I've always just been a huge fan of Myles Turner's game. And shout out to, I believe, Gang Time is his name. Anytime that I think like me or Clutch Takes, any of us, like anytime that we post any kind of like Raptors trade talk, he's always in there talking about Myles Turner. And I think it's for good reason too. I think you look at Myles Turner's skill set with the defense, obviously with the shooting touch and the pick and roll touch. I think Myles Turner has a lot of unique parts to his game that you can just see seamlessly translating to the Raptors offense. And with all that being said, I'm going to throw it over to Clutch Takes, and we're going to discuss this some more.
All right. Before I jump on the Myles Turner bandwagon to Toronto, I saw the comments on the last video, so I just want to quickly do something. It's not the Raptors.
Yeah.
Shout out Matthew, bro. You got him to make the change.
It's not the Raptors, but it's the Jays. So hopefully your guys are happy. But yeah, Myles Turner, I've always been a big fan of him. He's always been with Domantas Sabonis. And I don't know if that's affecting his usage at all, but he's always been in that like 13 points per game type of thing. And he's also been a really good defensive player. I saw he's like his metrics were like top 10 this year, I believe. He's obviously an elite shot blocker. He can also stretch the floor and hit that 3-point shot, which the Raptors always like. I think he fits the Raptors' identity really well. I was just saying to the guys that the Heat culture gets brought up a lot about how they have a team identity, but I feel like the Raptors have a certain culture and identity that is very identifiable. Being defense and 3-point shooting, very modern NBA, and people that work hard. And I feel like Myles Turner fits that. So depending what we have to give up, if that is Van Vliet on like the higher side or Gary Trent, I'm not sure if he's as much of a need for Indiana, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think I really like Myles Turner to the Raptors, but we do have to talk about some things he does not do. He's an elite shot blocker. That's great, but he is not a great rebounder. So that is one thing we would have to take into consideration when we do trade for Myles Turner, is that he doesn't necessarily solve our rebounding problem. He only averages about 6 or 7 rebounds per game. But then, as you mentioned there, he does share the floor with Domantas Sabonis, who's a great rebounder too. So maybe that does affect how his maybe affects his numbers and averages a little bit. But as far as it goes, when it comes to trade talks, I don't know if I'd personally give up Fred VanVleet or Gary Trent Jr. I think we can maybe get Myles Turner for a little bit cheaper, maybe give up some other assets and maybe, involve a third team and have some assets going to maybe the Indiana Pacers, other players. And maybe a name I want to throw out there is Chris Boucher. I know everyone loves Chris Boucher, but Myles Turner would be a nice addition to the Raptors, but that is someone I would have to consider and maybe throw in some other pieces as well.
Yeah, well, the thing with trade talk always is I feel like, and it's a natural inclination for fans, but I feel like fans always want to get the player without maybe necessarily realizing that they're gonna have to give up a good piece. I'm like, I actually really like Boucher, and then obviously with the Raptors cap space for this offseason, it's gonna be a little bit easier to make the numbers work, especially with a guy like Myles Turner that's on a relatively team friendly deal. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I want to say he's around like the 13 to 15 million range per year, which is frankly not that bad of a contract to be playing, especially for a player of his caliber. Excuse me. And I do think that what Dan brought up is a good point. I think his numbers are maybe a little stunted, in particular, maybe the rebounding numbers playing beside a guy like Sabonis, who is a very good rebounder. But I think in terms of identity, I completely agree with all of the points there where Myles Turner just fits what the Raptors are trying to do. And when it comes to figuring out who to give up, though, that's a little bit more of a question because obviously, if we're talking like straight up contract swaps, Freddie and Myles Turner are on very similar contracts, but I do want to say that Fred has more value. Maybe I'm biased because I'm a Raptors fan, but I do think he has more value than that. So I agree that the name of Chris Boucher is an interesting one to throw around, especially because I think Boucher would be an interesting fit besides Sabonis. And I think that would be an experiment that maybe they want to try out. And then coupled with that, maybe like Boucher and a couple of second rounders. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that one extensively, but for the most part, I think there's a deal that could be done there with Chris Boucher as the focal point of it. And I would love to get a player of Myles Turner's caliber on this team. I think it would just be so exciting to see him both worked into this offense and defense. I think for the most part, you're not going to hear the problems at the 5 spot brought up again. Yes, the rebounding might still be a little bit more of an issue, but that is also an overall team issue, I guess. So we can address that in other ways in terms of what the Raptors do this offseason. And I do think Myles isn't a bad rebounder. Again, I just think he plays beside a better one in Sabonis. So it'd be interesting. I mean, what are we thinking here? Like, I think Boucher, for the most part, is who we're more or less agreeing on that that's what we prefer to give up.
Yeah, I think Boucher would be good value-wise for like Indiana and Toronto, but at the same time, I don't know if Gary Trent fits their team because they already have players like TJ Warren and Levert and like score first players like that. So I don't know if that would just be like, and Jeremy Lamb off the bench. So I don't know how much of a fit he is necessarily there. And as for Myles Turner's rebounding, I don't think it'll be that big of a problem. As we've already said, I feel like his rebounding will go up without Domantas Sabonis. We weren't that great of a rebounding team. We were kind of middle of the pack. As when we had Serge Ibaka and Marc Gasol, they weren't insane rebounders, but they had excellent defense. And if we just go for someone that's just strictly based on rebounding, we're hunting for guys, our double-double guys, such as an Andre Drummond. We've seen how poorly that goes. And everyone's calling for him to playing for China next year. And he's not getting that max contract that he thought he was getting.
I'm so happy, with all due respect, that Andre Drummond's stint with the Lakers went the way it did, because this was exactly my point of why I didn't want him on the Raptors. I always thought of Andre Drummond as an overrated role player, with all due respect. He doesn't give you enough on the court. Like, we talked about this obviously before, Dan. This is literally the example of the empty stats argument. He's not a player that contributes to winning. And there were way too many Raptors fans just lobbying for Andre Drummond to end up on this team. And I'm so happy that can now just die. Don't get Drummond. We don't want him anywhere near this team. I don't care if you think you can salvage him. I don't want to take that chance. I watched him with the Lakers during the playoff run, and even before that. His offensive and defensive IQs are terrible, and I don't want that anywhere near this Raptors team.
Yeah, that was empty calories. I feel like more people were on the fence as they're just looking through the box score, not at his actual game. And you see those like, oh, he got 20 and 20 or something like that. He's underrated. But obviously, it matters way more about your defensive impact and offensive impact, being efficient. And Andre Drummond, we saw when he was on a Lakers team with championship aspirations, it just not go his way. And his hopes of getting a max deal. If whoever like just goes, some stupid front office gives that to him,
The Hornets
they're
will.
going to be stuck with a player who there's.
I feel like every
Oh, man.
offseason we see the Hornets throw big money at like one of the big men. Like, you'll see them. What did they pay Cody Zeller like $13 million for some weird reason? I don't understand. And last season, although they didn't sign
too.
and even last offseason, though, they didn't sign Montrezl Harrell. They were paying him something crazy like $20 million. I can't remember the exact details, but over 3 or 4 years was what they were rumored to be offering him. But he decided he wanted to sign with the Lakers. So I can definitely see the Hornets doing a really silly deal for Andre Drummond there. But I agree with you guys. It's empty stats. And even if he puts up 20 rebounds, his IQ is terrible. He doesn't contribute to winning. And I don't want him anywhere near the Raptors.
Moving on to our second topic of the day here. The Portland Trailblazers have once again done a whole lot of nothing in the playoffs, and Damian Lillard looked sensational out there in the first round. Obviously, he had that one performance in particular where people were sitting there questioning whether or not he was going to break the all-time scoring in a single game record. Obviously, passing Michael Jordan. He didn't, but I think he broke the threes record that game. That's a little besides the point. The point here is Damian Lillard, time and time again, seems like he is getting nowhere with the Portland Trailblazers. Is this the offseason where he finally sits down and says to himself, if I want to win a championship, I need to be somewhere else? Or does he still trust this front office to potentially retool that team around him, which, I mean, I wouldn't. Like, between us and whoever's watching, I wouldn't trust the Portland front office, but I'm just curious. What does everybody else think here? Is Dame's time in Portland coming to an end?
I think it definitely should be coming to an end. I feel like Dame has always been loyal to Portland. He's given them all that he can. I just think it's not going to happen. I think his patience might be even running a little bit thin. I know he posted that cryptic tweet, Instagram photo, wherever that was, saying like he quoted Nipsey Hussle or something, saying how long can he wait? I just think it's time for him to have a fresh start and whatever team that may be. And with Portland moving him potentially, I think it's time to fully like commit to a new team. And in that sense, like moving off pieces like CJ McCollum or Nurkic, try to build up a new core to try to compete for different championships.
I agree. I think it's he has to really push the front office and the management to a similar deal of how Giannis did with the Bucks. He didn't sign the extension till they made some big moves. I think he has to pressure the front office to make some nice moves. And I've mentioned this in one of my videos. I think it's time to break up that backcourt of CJ and Damian Lillard. It hasn't been working for 8+ seasons now. I think it's time to move on and try something different. And I think they can try and move CJ and get some nice pieces in return. I don't think they'll probably get a better player than CJ if you're just doing a 1-for-1 trade, but I do think they could surround him with better pieces, re-sign Norman Powell. But it depends. It depends on entirely what Damian Lillard wants. We know he's been committed to playing for the Blazers for some time now. Is he running out of patience? Maybe he is, but we'll have to wait and see what the management does, if they try to improve the roster, if they're making any changes. If they're not, if I'm Damian Lillard, I'm asking out of Portland because let's be honest, he's given it his best. It's clearly not working, and sometimes you just have to say, it's time to move on.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, listen, the Blazers have been putting players around Dame that either don't necessarily compliment him or just shells of their former selves or just washed or just bargain bin options for so long now. And if I was a player the caliber of a Damian Lillard, I would be frustrated as hell with it at this point, especially because Dame seems like somebody that wants to be a winner. I think by all intents and purposes, outside the fact that he hasn't actually won a championship, he is a winner. And I don't think he's going to do that in Portland at this point. So I'm really hoping he takes his bags and he packs them and he goes somewhere else and Portland just enters a full-blown rebuild because as you've said, Prab, I don't think that backcourt is working. I don't think that backcourt will ever work. I mean, literally the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think we have hit that point. I think Dame and CJ have too much overlap in terms of what they do on the court, and they don't necessarily complement each other. That pairing is not going to work for a championship level team. And at this point, if I'm Dame, I'm eyeing some of these teams that are maybe like one big trade away from being a championship contender. and thinking, hey, I could be that one big trade. So with that being said, where do we like Damian Lillard if he ends up leaving?
Yeah, I mentioned this before we started this podcast, but I really think the Philadelphia 76ers would be a great fit for Damian Lillard. Obviously, the Philadelphia 76ers have a lot of assets that would potentially interest them, starting off with Ben Simmons. JJ has been a big advocate of if Ben Simmons goes to a different team, he could work out really well. So that could entice the Portland Trailblazers as a nice starting off piece. And for Dame, I feel like him and Embiid would pair pretty well together. I feel like Embiid, everyone always says like a score first player, and someone like of that caliber, of that ilk of Dame would really pair well with him. And I feel like obviously Philly was interested in James Harden. That just never happened. I think they should have did that. Obviously that's in the past now, but I feel like Damian Lillard is the next best thing if Philly wants to get into that championship conversation.
I agree. I think Philadelphia is a really nice team for Damian Lillard. It makes a lot of sense on some of the points you touched on. Him and Embiid would be deadly. You have Embiid who needs to be double teamed in the post, regardless of who you have as your big man, unless you're Marc Gasol. But besides that, I think you always have to double team Embiid just because of how dominant he is. He's a very skilled big man. And add on top of that, you have someone at the 3-point line like Damian Lillard. That's going to be a deadly combination. But with that being said, I do have my own team who I think would make really nice with Damian Lillard, and that is the LA Lakers. Now, they don't have the pieces to acquire Damian Lillard unless they're throwing Anthony Davis in there.
What do you mean? Talon Horton Tucker, bro.
Sign and trade, right? But yeah, no, I just don't see the Lakers having that asset. I don't see them moving on from AD. So I really think, and LeBron has said this for a while too, him and Damian Lillard would be an absolute deadly combination if they were somehow to pair those two together. And that's going to be really hard because we know they're not going to break up LeBron and AD. So I do think Philadelphia is the realistic destination for Damian Lillard, considering all the pieces they can give Portland Trail Blazers in return.
I do really like Philly. I more or less agree with everything you guys have said in that regard. I think Embiid and Lillard's games just complement each other really well. And like Dan said, I would like to see Ben Simmons in a situation where you can build the team around him more than what's been done in Philadelphia, where obviously Embiid is the focal point. Because I do think Simmons has another level he can get to when he's put in a different situation. Just the situation he's in now doesn't necessarily cater to him. So if I'm Portland, I would really like that. If we're going to throw one more team into the mix, I mean, incredibly biased here, but Toronto would be interesting. I mean, we all know we're a star away, but then again, this is more just hometown bias. I think Toronto definitely has the pieces to throw Portland's way. I think that's not the issue. It's more of how much are the Raptors going to give up and be able to sustain a championship level core in that situation? And would Dame just end up in a similar situation in Portland? I don't think so on the latter part, because I do think Masai knows how to manage that kind of thing a lot better. And I know he can put together a championship team as opposed to what's going on in Portland. But that being said, I mean, I would love to see the Raptors add Damian Lillard to this team, but it's really hard to envision Damian Lillard being added to this team without losing at least one or two pieces that really make this team special. All that being said, I think that's going to take us to our last topic of the day here, and that brings us to the NBA playoffs. Now, we've obviously talked to the NBA playoffs in a certain extent in previous videos. Today, we're further along in the playoffs, and at this point, it really looks like Brooklyn is the head and shoulders front runner, but I don't think that means there's no team out there that can't knock them off. I think each of us kind of look at one team or another and think, yeah, that team could beat the Nets, in the finals. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it along. Who are candidates to surprise and shock the Nets in the playoffs this year?
Honestly, I feel like it's hard to pick someone out of the East for me, but for the West, we've seen how well the Utah Jazz and the Suns are doing in their series. I feel like they will meet in the conference finals. And I know you guys are big components for the Suns, and I feel like that series will go 7 games. But honestly, I'm going to lean with the Jazz. I'm just going to take the Jazz just because I like the way Donovan Mitchell has been playing. He's been elevating his status to superstar status. He just seems like one of those guys that steps up in the playoffs big time. It's a bit of controversy about Rudy Gobert winning the DPOY, but he's a big part of their team identity. They were a top 5 offense and a top 5 defense in the regular season, and it seems to be translating into the playoffs. They have a lot of great players. I even saw like a stat, role players on their team, such as Bogdanovich or Bojan. I always get those I get those two mixed up a little bit. But in the game 2, he shut down Kawhi to only like 2 or 4 points in the fourth quarter or something like that when guarding him. So I feel like they have a really deep squad. So does Phoenix. And I think it's going to be close, but I'm just going to say the Jazz.
I have to disagree with you here. Now, the reason I don't think it's the Jazz is because they have a great defense. Let's talk about their defense. Now, they might slow down the Brooklyn Nets, but they're not going to outscore them. They don't have the offensive power out. I know it's funny. I see that because they've been putting up a lot of points against the Clippers, but outside of Donovan Mitchell and Jordan Clarkson, who else is really producing for you offensively? Joe Ingles, yes, he can score points, and yes, Bogdanovich as well, but can you rely on them consistently to give you 20 points per game? I don't know. I think I'm more confident in the Brooklyn Nets big 3 than I am with the nice pieces they surrounded Donovan Mitchell with. That being said, this is going to be a controversial one because this team I'm about to see has already gotten blown out by the Nets in at least, I believe, one of the games. But I think the Milwaukee Bucks, of all teams, have a really good chance against the Nets. Now, the reason I say that is because you throw the personnel players, you look at Giannis Antetokounmpo, and then you can rival him with KD. I know KD's a better scorer, but Giannis is a good defender. He's a rebounder. He'll get you points as well. And then you got Chris Middleton. I'm not going to rival him to Kyrie or Harden because he's not at that level, but he is someone who can get you a lot of buckets. And then Drew Holiday's a really nice defensive player as well. So I think they have a little, I don't want to call them the big 3, but if you want to call them a mini big 3, if that makes sense, I think that is probably the team that will rival the Brooklyn Nets really well, because I just don't see any other team really having a good chance against the Brooklyn Nets. And it's unfortunate they do meet in the second round because it would have been a better matchup in the conference finals. But that is my pick to upset the Nets.
So you're saying if the Bucks don't do it in this round, nobody's going to do it. God damn. I don't necessarily trust Coach Bud enough to really think that the Bucks are going to pull this series out. I think they need to move on from him as a head coach. I think he's gotten them to a certain point, and now they need another coach to take them over the top. As for the Jazz, I mean, I understand that they're a top 5 team defensive unit, but in terms of individual matchups, I just don't see them matching up well with the Nets. I'm going to go with the Suns. I like the Suns for a couple of reasons. Because I do think while they don't necessarily have the personnel to shut down Brooklyn, nobody's going to shut down Brooklyn. I do think they have at least a couple of good bodies to throw at guys there. I think Jay Crowder is somebody that you can at least throw on KD and pray for the best. I think both Chris Paul and Bridges are both very good defenders in their own right. Obviously, Chris Paul is a little old at this point, but he's still a decent defender. I think you can play around with the matchups a little bit there and potentially have Crowder on KD, have Bridges on Kyrie, just because Kyrie is obviously, I'd say, the most shifty of all of those guys, and then put Chris Paul on James Harden, and at least feel somewhat okay with the matchups there. I don't think anybody guarding Brooklyn is going to be thrilled, but I think you feel at least somewhat at ease. And then when it comes to the other side of the basketball court, obviously we talked about the fact that we don't necessarily, or at least me and the Warriors Report, don't necessarily think that the Jazz are going to be keeping up offensively with the Nets. I think the Suns could. I think between Devin Booker and his sensational individual scoring and Chris Paul just setting everybody up on that team for the Suns, I think the Suns could actually go toe-to-toe and say like a 3-point shootout with the Brooklyn Nets, or any kind of shootout, really. I do think they have that firepower. I also think they have really good depth coming off that bench. We've obviously seen the career resurgence of Campaign off the bench for the Suns, and just a bunch of other guys. They have quality players coming off that bench, and I do think that depth should play at least somewhat of a factor. And honestly, I don't know whether or not I'm wrong to think so, but I hold Devin Booker in a higher regard than I do Donovan Mitchell. So if I'm picking between those two guys specifically, I'd rather have Booker going toe-to-toe with the with the Nets. I just think Booker has that swagger that he's going to walk into that building. He's going to see Kevin Durant. He's going to see James Harden. He's going to see Kyrie Irving, and he's going to think he's the best player on the court every single game.
The Kendall Jenner effect. It's a reverse Kardashian effect.
He's the first. I don't know if
he's got that Kendall Jenner swagger.
I don't know if Kendall Jenner counts as a Kardashian, but I do remember seeing a tweet earlier these playoffs. I think it was from Noor. Shout out to her. She's like my favorite follow on Raptors Twitter, saying that Devin Booker might be the first player to beat the Kardashian curse.
Hey, Tristan Thompson technically won that championship when I believe he was with the I can't remember their names. There's too many of them to keep track of. But Khloe Kardashian. He was
with Chloe, right?
Oh, Chloe, sorry. I mispronounced her name too, but yeah.
Although, I mean, is that Tristan Thompson beating the Kardashian curse, or is that LeBron James beating the Kardashian curse?
That's true. That's true.
Oh, God. I mean, here's the other thing, too. I'm not entirely convinced that the Clippers are done with that series yet. Yes, I know the Jazz are up 2-0, but I mean, the Clippers literally were just in a worse situation with the Mavericks in terms of losing the first two games on their home court. I think that's another team that could maybe push the Nets. And at least with that one, you have a bona fide superstar on the court with Kawhi Leonard going at the Nets. But I don't know. Like, I don't – it's far from me to assume something of a team's psyche, but I just don't think the Clippers have that mentality that they need to be a championship level squad. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll prove me wrong by the end of the playoffs, but I just don't know if they're there besides for maybe Kawhi Leonard in terms of having the right mindset.
Yeah, I would agree with that for the Clippers. I think Kawhi definitely has that mindset, but as a team, I just don't necessarily see it. This is why Kawhi was such a perfect fit for the Raptors, as he had a bunch of dogs on his team, such as like Kyle Lowry, Van Vliet, Siakam's at his best. I don't want to go on a tangent about the Raptors, how great that team was, but the Clippers are not the Raptors. Don't get it twisted. As for the Utah Jazz and Suns, like I said, it was going to be really close. I feel like if they match up, I feel like I could see that series definitely going 7 and being a classic. I feel like Devin Booker and Donovan Mitchell, they're really close to each other. I feel like I like how Devin Booker has stepped up this playoffs. Obviously, JJ kind of called it. I'll give JJ its props there. But yeah, I think Donovan Mitchell too, though. I think he has something to prove. I saw, I don't know if you guys remember that clip when Shaq told him he doesn't have what it takes to go to the next level. And he's like, I bet. And like... I don't know. Like,
Donovan is such a different player to regular season Donovan too. Like he just plays so much better in the playoffs.
Yeah, and even last year's playoffs, I gained a lot of respect from him. I swear he was averaging like 37. He had to carry a lot of the offensive load, but he carried that Jazz team against like a Nuggets team with obviously Jamal Murray going off. Same with Nikola Jokic. Their pick and roll game was insane. And I don't know. Like, I feel like they have like that confidence this year, the depth. And he also said, well, Bojan Bogdanovic, he said he was a key piece missing last year from their playoff run. He kept saying it. I just remember, I'm just like, that's interesting. It's kind of like how Crowder on the Suns, he's been kind of like their guy, their glue guy or something like that. He was on the Heat just last year in the championship. He's like that lucky guy for them. That might be the same.
I don't know if it's luck. I just think Jay Crowder is a role player you would love to have in almost any locker room. I just think he brings the right mentality anytime he steps on the court.
Not necessarily luck, I mean, but like a glue guy or something like that. Like it brings the team together.
True.
Yeah.
That's true. I have to agree with JJ here. I don't see the Jazz making that run just because I just don't see them. Their defense might be great, but I feel like we've seen the Nets run with a smaller lineup. I don't know how Rudy Gobert is going to defend that. He's a great defender, don't get me wrong, but I just don't see him being in the pick and roll game. Can he really keep up with guys like Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving? I just don't see that happening. So I'm still sticking with my pick. I really like the Suns too, though, JJ. I have to agree with you there. I really like the Suns. I think Devin Booker proved that already in the Lakers series alone. Like he's a superstar in the making. No one can stop him, and he's just going off in every series. Even against Denver here, he's doing a really good job. So I don't really see anyone on the Nets that can defensively stop Devin Booker. And then you also have Chris Paul, and let's not forget about DeAndre Ayton as well. He's a solid big man, and they have some nice pieces, as you mentioned, Dan. Jay Crowder is a nice piece to surround those three guys with as well. So I think I have to agree, Suns, and I'm still sticking with Brooklyn. With my Bucks. But I think if not, the Suns do have a solid chance of upsetting the Nets as well.
Oh, it sounds so weird hearing a Raptors fan say "my Bucks."
Did I say my? I meant like my team in this conversation, like the team I'm choosing.
Blasphemy! Blasphemy!
No, always the Raptors. Always the Raptors.
Then again, I'm throwing stones from a glass house. Lord knows I like LeBron and I root for the Raptors. So,
yeah.
That being said, I mean, I also want to give some credit to the Sixers here in this discussion as well. I would have liked the Sixers a lot more as an option had Danny Green not just gone down with an injury. I think defensively, Danny gives you a lot, even if he is maybe not what he once was as an offensive piece. But I don't know if I really trust him. The other part of the Sixers, too, is it really hinges a lot on Joel Embiid's health. And with the amount of just rough falls that he takes seemingly every game, it always feels like the Sixers are one Joel Embiid injury away from just not being relevant in the playoffs anymore, right?
Yeah, and didn't he also, I'm pretty sure it came out that he has like a small meniscus injury he's dealing with even right now, or he's playing through. I swear I heard something like that. It's not like major, but he's playing through that. And yeah, I would agree. Like every time he falls, I'm not even a 76ers fan. I just don't like to see people get injured. It's just like I'm holding my breath because I've had knee injuries myself. I'm just like, damn, this guy can't catch a break. Yeah.
Oh, man.
I'd have to agree. I think 76ers are a nice team too, but I just don't ultimately see it. I'm not a big Ben Simmons guy. JJ, I know you are. I think he's one of those guys you can't rely on within the last 5 minutes of the game. He's a great ball handler.
I wouldn't even say I'm a big Ben Simmons guy, as opposed to the fact that I just think he's overhated, and I like to balance that kind of thing out with, talking about everything that Ben Simmons does great on the basketball court. It's kind of similar to how I look at, or like I have a similar approach with James Harden, where I thought people were just hating the shit out of this guy for ages for no great reason other than, I don't know, some like really nitpicky situational arguments against him that I'm like, okay, so we're just going to ignore that James Harden's been one of the best players over the past decade, probably in NBA history in certain regards. We're just going to ignore all that. It's kind of one of those attitudes there with me and Ben, similar to that, where I'm just like, okay, if all of you guys, which for the most part by you guys, I mean NBA casuals, are just going to rip these guys to shreds for no good reason, I'll at least, I don't know, I don't want to say play devil's advocate because I feel like that has such a bad that has bad mojo around it nowadays, but like I will play devil's advocate and just be like, no, you guys are not giving these players the credit they are due.
Yeah, people definitely just target players. Like we talked about this before, like Pandemic P, like people are ready as soon as he has one bad game to rip him to shreds on Twitter.
NBA Twitter is at its quietest when Paul George is playing great basketball.
Honestly, like he doesn't deserve it, man. Like he's been pretty solid this playoffs, like besides like maybe a game or two. Like Jimmy Butler played an absolutely dog shit series. I'm sorry, but he got like zero hate. I like Jimmy Butler too. I think he's a dog, and he just had a really bad series. People just got to keep the same energy.
I agree. I think so too. But I'm gonna disagree with you guys. I think Paul George deserves every hate that's coming his way. I really liked him before he came to the Clippers, but he has just said some stupid things. We saw that shot. He talked about Damian Lillard being a bad shot, and
technically speaking, for any other player other than Damian Lillard or Steph Curry, that is a bad shot.
It is, but I don't think that's something you see, especially after the guy has made that game-winning shot. I mean, it's just like insulting your own self, especially because he was defending Damian Lillard on that particular play. But I think it's just his attitude in general. Every series you've seen through over the last several years, even when he was with the Pacers, he doesn't own up to his mistakes. He's always making excuses. And even last season when they were up, I believe they were up 3-1, he said he's not worried about the Denver Nuggets, even when they went to Game 7. So I think it's just that kind of attitude that really throws off people. He has a selfish attitude. On top of that, he knocked off a stripper and married her, and he paid her to abort the baby. But we won't get into too many details there for anti-abortions and.
Ooh, that came out of left field.
Yeah.
I'm not a big Paul George fan. I get where you guys are coming from. Definitely, some players definitely get overhated, but I think he talks a little bit too much.
You don't think he's one of them?
I think it's justified. I think it's justified for Paul George.
Yeah, I mean, like, I hear you where it's like some of the things that he says, he really does bring it upon himself. But for the most part, I feel like as a player, I know what to expect out of Paul George. And for the most part, he delivers on those expectations. Some people, for whatever reason, hold him to the caliber of a player better than he is. And maybe that's because Paul George talks about himself like a player better than he is. But yeah, like for the most part, I feel like a lot of the slander is just reaching where I'm just like, okay, come on, man. Like he just played a great series and you're nitpicking at like the 1 or 2 games that he played poorly. I'm like, all right. But anyways, we are gearing off topic. So that is a good sign to wrap this one up. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and supporting us. These videos are always a huge pleasure to make, and it is obviously so much fun to see you guys react to them and give us your takes. So, on behalf of everybody at the Raptors Roundtable here, thank you. Just truly.
Thank you guys. See you guys next time.
See you guys next time. Thank you so much for supporting our channels.